Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends, and welcome to part 2 of our 6-part Aether Revolt full set review. Today we're going to look at all the blue cards, as well as the Dimir cards and Izzet cards that are in the set. And if you've watched these videos before, you probably know what to expect. We're going to look at each card, talk briefly about them. I try to keep things moving. We're going to focus on each card in the limited format at first, and then, of course, anything that is relevant to other formats like Standard or Commander, we'll discuss that as well. Having said that, before we get started, if you check out the description below, you'll see some links to our Amazon affiliate store. And if you make any purchases through any of those links, whether it's Aether Revolt products or anything else, a small percentage will come back to help support the channel, which is greatly appreciated. Also, you'll see some links to our Amazon affiliate store, another amazing way to help us out and support what we do. So having said that, we got a lot of cards to talk about. So let's get into the cards for today. We're going to start off with Aether Swooper. Not a lot to say about this one. This is a cycle of cards. You're going to see one of these in each color. We saw the white one yesterday. And tomorrow we'll see the black one, which is actually a little bit better. The red one's probably my favorite of the 5, but they all do similar things. They all have an ability that kind of coincides with their color. And when they enter the battlefield, you get 2 energy. And then, of course, whenever it attacks, you can pay that 2 to get a 1/1 colorless servo token. So here's the deal in limited. It's only a 1/2 flyer. I maybe would have been a little more impressed with this if it was a 2/1 flyer and I could go a little more aggro early on with it. But as a 1/2, it's not super exciting to me. I'll run this if I'm really desperate for more ways to get energy, or I'm looking for more ways to produce servo tokens. If my deck is interested in either of those things in limited, then this becomes a more appealing card. I mean, it is a 2-drop. 2-drops are important, and you want to have plenty of them in your curve. So it's certainly playable, but it's not one of my favorites. It might not always make your cut. It just depends on what your deck's doing. Aethertide Whale. When I first saw this card spoiled, I kind of made the joke that it feels like an intro deck rare, and it does. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, intro deck rares traditionally were cards that were great in limited, but didn't really do a whole lot aside from limited. And I think that's probably the perfect definition for this card. It costs 6, but it's a 6/4 flyer. I mean, you're getting a lot of punch out of it in a limited game, and this gives you a fair amount of energy. I mean, 6 energy when this enters the battlefield, and also you can pay 4 energy to return it to your hand, which does a couple things. It can protect it, but it also can turn on Revolt. One thing you'll notice when we go through the blue cards today, the Revolt mechanic, you won't find it here, but you find a lot of cards that enable it. And if you're pairing this up with, say, a color like white we saw yesterday that has a lot of Revolt, then they do work really well together. So just keep that in mind as we go through these cards today. But yeah, fantastic for a couple of reasons. It turns on Revolt. It's a big old beater. And if you're looking for a way to get a lot of energy in a limited game, it's another way to do it. One thing I will point out about energy too, as a side note, there's not as many really great energy payoffs in Aether Revolt as we saw in Kaladesh, but you are still playing with in draft 1 pack of Kaladesh, 2 packs in sealed. So if you're lucky enough to pull an Aetherworks Marvel or something like that, right, then all of a sudden this card becomes even more important to your deck. So there you have it. But yeah, like I said, overall, fine limited card. All right, here's one of the big ones, Burrell, Chief of Compliance. A lot of people buzzing about this card. And I'll tell you, from my point of view, someone who's played Magic for a really long time, I've seen the game change a lot over the years. One thing I've noticed in recent history is Wizards is very shy about 2 archetypes in the standard format. And those archetypes are combo and control. Strangely enough, in some ways, those 2 go together because they keep each other in check a little bit. Having a strong control archetype means that you want something that can be fast and explosive, that can beat it out sometimes before it gets its mana in place, and that a lot of times is a combo deck. Sometimes it's an aggro deck. On the flip side, combo decks need something to keep them in control. They need the counter magic, somebody to stop their combos, and that's when control decks are probably at their best. Having said that, Aether Revolt is seemingly bringing control and combo back into the forefront, which is really interesting. And this card, of course, one of the key pieces to a control deck. When I first saw this card spoiled, my first impression was, wow, this will be great in Vintage, Legacy, probably even Modern to some degree. Awesome in Commander if you have a real spiky Commander deck. But I thought it will be good in Standard, but I don't know if it'll be great in Standard because will it have the other pieces to back it up for a good control deck? Well, I can tell you now that I've seen the whole set, yeah, I do think it does have the other pieces to back it up, combined with the fact that they've been sprinkling some good control cards in sets for the last year or so now. I mean, we've seen everything from originally Scatter to the Winds, which was okay, and then we got Reflector Mage and Spell Queller, and now we're getting some serious counter magic and cards like this that really enable the control elements to flourish. So, yes, first off, I'm going to say this. This will be played quite a bit in Standard. Yes, I still think it's amazing in Vintage and Legacy. If you have that spiky commander deck, not for all play groups probably, but for some, this will be cool. Even good in cubes if you have a control element in your cubes. But again, another interesting thing is I feel like this is a card that's going to be important in Standard going forward because of the potential of combo decks that could start to rise to prominence over the next few weeks. One example that came up, Willie Adel actually tweeted this out yesterday after I made my video, so I missed this combo when I was talking about Felidar Guardian, but I'm sure Willie's already playtesting with these cards anyway, so I'm assuming he's going to the next Pro Tour. He's a Hall of Famer. But this combo here, Felidar Guardian and Saheeli Rai, is actually basically Splinter Twin. So there you go. Like for turn 3, you play Saheeli. Turn 4, you play Felidar Guardian. And game over, right? Like, that's insane to think that this is going to be something in Standard. You need control to be able to keep something like this in check. And even then, this could still steal a game here and there, which is pretty amazing. Another combo that we're going to talk about later in the week, because we haven't gotten to this card yet, but Crackdown Construct, which is one of the artifacts in this set, play this with Wandering Fumarole. Now, this isn't quite as explosive because this combo basically creates a giant creature, but it still has to get by for its damage and stuff. So it isn't a game-ending combo, but it is another interesting combo. And there are some other combo elements that we saw in Kaladesh that never quite got there to top tier in Standard last time around, but maybe with cards like this, because they all fall into either colorless or Jeskai colors. This time around, maybe we're looking at a Jeskai control deck that's using a number of these elements and just trying to hit whichever one they can hit. That could be pretty dangerous. So that's crazy, and all the more reason that cards like Burrell, Chief of Compliance, are going to be super important going forward. This really makes other cards better too. We're going to talk about that a couple times as we go through the list today. Burrells Expertise. All right, another explosive card. These Expertises are amazing, and there's one in each color again. We saw the white one yesterday. This one may be one of my favorites of them all. One of the reasons I really like this one is, yes, it costs a little more at 5, but you get a free spell that also is a little more at 4. Playing free spells typically is awesome, right? I don't need to tell you that. And there's so many crazy chains you can do with these cards. First off, I want to point out the ability on here, return up to 3 target artifacts and or creatures to their owner's hand. There's a lot of versatility just in that ability, because you can use that in the traditional way, bounce a bunch of your opponent's stuff, just attack in, and it's huge tempo play, beats them down. It could win you the game. And oh, by the way, you get a free spell after that. That's pretty awesome. Or you can use it to do things like maybe attack in with some of your creatures, then bounce your own creatures, which could turn on Revolt for you, which could be very key. Or if you really want to get crazy, attacking with some of your creatures, return them to your hand, then go ahead and play a free Yahini's Expertise, another card we're going to talk about actually tomorrow, and that gives all creatures -3/-3, kind of wipe a lot of your opponent's stuff, if not all of it, and then you get to put one of your own creatures back down again for free, potentially. Those kind of chains, we're going to be seeing that in Standard. Again, that is crazy. All the more reason control decks are going to become important, I think, and this is some awesome stuff, really. I have a feeling we're going to be seeing a lot of these Expertises around. Next, we have Bastion Adventure. Now, this is more of a limited card, but it's a good one. I mean, 4/4 for 6 is fine considering it has hexproof, but throw Improvise on there, it becomes that much better for a lot of decks in limited. So I like this a lot. It's just hard for your opponent to deal with. It's a nice size beater. I don't think it's going to be like a standard control finisher, just because there's better options out there from previous sets, and there's even some better options out there in this set, maybe in other colors if you're looking at a Dimir control deck, for example, and we'll look at some of the black cards tomorrow. But yeah, this is definitely cool and limited. Disallow. This is actually huge because of Burrell more than anything. But I still think, even if you take Burrell out of the equation, because with him in the equation, this card is actually better than the original counterspell, which is kind of insane to think about. But even without that combination, the fact that you have a cancel that can also give you the option to instead hit an activated ability or triggered ability is actually quite good. Here's the thing that's interesting about cancel. Counterspell for 2 blue has always seemed probably too powerful, where cancels kind of seemed not powerful enough at 2 blue and 1. So in recent years, they've tried to give us cancels with a little bit something extra tacked on, and they've been playable. But this one, I feel, really kind of hits home for me. Like, if you ever played with Stifle, for example, in Legacy, you know how powerful that type of effect can be. So you have the ability to Stifle either an activated ability or triggered ability on top of the fact that it's also a counterspell. It makes me really feel like that 1 extra mana is worth it in this case, where a lot of times I don't always feel that way. So that's pretty cool. I think this is another card that we'll see a lot of standard play again, because there will be control decks out there. And again, good for you in limited too. Dispersion Technician. This one's okay if you're trying to turn on Revolt and you have limited options to do it, I think. Maybe you're playing an Azorius deck or something like that and you're really all in on Revolt. Then it's fine for you in limited. Other than that, I'm probably not touching this card. It's a 3/2 for 5. Yes, the effect can go on to have some good things happen for you, perhaps, with some other cards. But if you don't have those cards, this isn't super exciting. Next, we have Efficient Construction. I'm kind of torn on this card. On one hand, I like it because I like decks that create Thopter tokens, and I think that can be a powerful strategy, especially if maybe you're in some sort of Izzet build and there's a lot of support for something like that. And if you can ramp into this a little bit, I feel better about it. But again, Izzet doesn't always have a whole lot of ways to ramp. I feel like this card is a tad slow for what it's trying to do. Like, I don't like playing 4-drop enchantments that don't do anything when you play them. I mean, you're basically taking a turn off with the hopes to have some big turns in the future. If it pays off, wonderful. But another thing to keep in mind is there's a lot of artifact hate out there right now, and even as standard, you're going to find in sideboards, if nothing else. And a lot of artifact hate also happens to hit enchantments. So decks are already kind of prepared for this card, whether they know it or not. And that makes me a little weary about it, at least at this point in the meta. Maybe in the future it's a little bit different. So having said that, it could still work in some limited decks for you, because I think the payoff is good enough to take the risk of taking the turn off. And it might be a little harder for your opponent to find an answer for it compared to Constructed. But yeah, sometimes it's a card that you might want to avoid. It just depends on what your deck's trying to do in limited. Hinterland Drake. I actually like this a lot in limited. Yes, there's a drawback. It can't block artifact creatures, but you know what? I like paying the price of a Windrake for a 2/3 flyer as opposed to a 2/2 flyer. I'm on board for that. And yes, it's a little annoying in Kaladesh that it can block artifacts, but I think it's aggressive enough and it survives a lot of things that are out there in the format right now, like Shock, that I'm very happy to run it in limited. Ice Over. This is an okay answer to some problems you could encounter in limited. The awkwardness of these type of spells, though, is the fact that it doesn't deal with everything. For example, Vigilance creatures doesn't really do much for them. Also, too, if someone plays something big, you can play this on it. They're still getting one good shot at you, though, which is a little awkward. It only costs 2. Another downside, though, is it is an enchantment, which, again, Artifact Hate a lot of times hits enchantments, too, so it makes it a little more fragile than maybe in other environments. We've seen this with pacifism-style effects already in Kaladesh, so this is another card that would be potentially a target of those things. So it's there if you need it. And that's the thing with blue. Blue doesn't have always a lot of great answers to artifacts or creatures. So this is a answer. And sometimes this is the only answer you have in your sealed pool, right? Like, that's just how things will end up. And if that's the case, it's very, very runnable. But it won't always make your cut. Sometimes you'll have better stuff. Illusionist Stratagem. This one I really like, and actually the next couple of cards fall under the umbrella of they're fast because they're instants and they also cantrip, which that is awesome. I love cards that are instants and cantrip. You can get tons of value out of there. They just keep you moving through your deck. Great for control style decks. Now this one in particular lets you flicker 2 creatures that you control. Now, that's really interesting because blue doesn't always get the flicker effect straightforward. Blue a lot of times gets the bounce effect. Like, take your creatures back to your hand, now you have to recast them to get the advantage. And that could be an advantage of either turning on Revolt or perhaps just getting some good enter the battlefield effects from Kaladesh cards, stuff like that. But this time around, at instant speed, you can flicker everything. It turns on your Revolt. So again, if you're playing with some strong Revolt cards, this is almost an auto-include in Limited. It feels really good to me. Potentially, I don't know if there's going to be a deck that will need something like this in Standard, but again, because it's at instant speed and cantrips, if there is, this will be the go-to card, I think. Leave in Dust. And yet again, another instant, cost 4. It lets you cantrip. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand this time around. So this is a little more traditional kind of blue bounce, but again, does a couple different things for you in this game. It will either do the traditional thing, and that's a nice tempo play against your opponent. They go all in, play their big thing, you return it to their hand, you get another attack in. Or, in this case, you return your own thing to your hand, and then you're able to turn on Revolt, play it again, maybe get a good enters the battlefield effect, and you start kind of juggling your cards that way. Becomes really strong. So great Limited card for sure. And I think this one, maybe even more so than the last one, will definitely see some Standard play in a more control style build. Or again, if there's a Revolt trigger that a deck's trying to trigger, this is another good way to do it. Mechanized Production. This one's a Mythic. Now, this has people already kind of thinking about different sort of crazy brews already, and I love that. And some of these brews, I think, are very, very good. Some great ideas that will probably convert into a Standard deck sooner than later, right? So, if you're not familiar with this card, you can enchant an artifact. It can be an artifact creature if you want, but it works like a Followed Footsteps. Every upkeep, you get a token that's a copy of the card. But if you, at any time after you make a copy, if at that time you have 8 or more of the same artifact, or an artifact with the same name, I should say, then you win the game. So that's actually kind of awesome, right? Like, people love these alternate win conditions, and they always capture the imagination. But this one I think is serious. First off, it only costs 4. They're not asking you to pay 6, 7, 8 for something like this. So that's cool. Secondly, there's some real cool targets for this. Servo tokens, maybe the first one to come to mind, just because that's what you're used to seeing recently in Kaladesh. But what about clue tokens? That's what's got a lot of people buzzing right now, is clue style decks with this. Because what I like about the clues is if you're winning and you're ahead on board state, then you just keep making clues, and eventually you get to 8, and on your upkeep, when you make the 8th one, you win the game. Awesome. That's phenomenal. But if you're behind, you can start cashing those clues in to catch back up. And all of a sudden, you start taking over the card advantage. And yeah, it puts your win condition back a little bit, but maybe you just win the traditional way that way. Or now you get your board state gummed up to the point where you can win with this win condition. That's really interesting to me. I think that could be a really cool deck, and I feel like we're going to see that in Standard at some point very soon. Also, if you're playing this in Limited, for example, even, sometimes it's just good as a Followed Footsteps. Like, if you ever played Followed Footsteps in Limited, maybe you played it in Conspiracy Take the Crown, it's a good card, right? Like, you put this on a good artifact creature and you just get another copy every turn, that becomes overwhelming really fast too. So, really awesome card here. And this combos very well with things like Saheeli too, which could expedite the process a little bit, stuff like that. So again, maybe this is part of a Jeskai deck that's running other combos too. Who knows? Could be interesting. Metallic Rebuke. This card, when it was first spoiled, what I said was, this will be good and Limited for you. In fact, great Limited. And in Standard, it will see Standard play. It's going to be better in some decks than others. Mana Leak for 3 isn't super exciting, but Mana Leak for 2 or 1, if you have the artifacts to back it up, is actually really, really good. Having said that, though, lots changed since this card was originally spoiled. We've seen Burrell, we've seen the advent of perhaps some strong combo decks, and now I will tell you that this card, I think its premium and Standard has gone up a lot. So this is a cool card in Standard. Whether you have the artifacts to back it up or not, and I think some decks probably will, this is still very, very, very Standard playable, and we will see it there. This is going to be a real good control card, and with Burrell, obviously, it gets even better. Negates, hey, it's a reprint. We all know Negate. We love Negate. It's been around a long, long time. Seems like it never really leaves standard, or at least not for very long. Many times it will leave and then comes right back, or else it even crosses over with itself. But it's just one of those staples that's always kind of there. And again, it's good. It's even better now, I think, with Burrell yet again. And it's going to help you deal perhaps with some of the combos that could appear out there. Deals with Planeswalkers very well, which could be important. Quicksmith Spy. This is a good limited card. You're paying 4 for a 2/3, but as long as you have an artifact in play, giving that artifact the ability to tap to draw a card is kind of nice. Even if you only draw 1 card off of it, if you draw 2 cards off of it, you're starting to get some real value here. And I think it's just runnable. Just if you get 1 card even, you'll be fine with it in limited. It's a nice size body, even though you do feel like you're a little overpaying initially, but as long as you can get the card draw, it's good. Reverse Engineer. Hey, guess what? Another great control card. All right, so first off, a lot of people said, well, it's not Treasure Cruise. Well, you know what? We're never going to see Treasure Cruise again. That was too good. And that was a mistake, obviously. This is, I think, actually fairly close to Treasure Cruise, at least in this environment. But yes, it's not quite there, but it's still really, really good. It's not an instant. It's a sorcery. That's fine with me, too, because I think instant would have been too powerful. You could potentially play this for 2 blue and get yourself 3 cards. Amazing, amazing effect here. This is exactly what control decks need to keep going. Control decks are going to be land heavy. They're going to be playing a lot of their lands, and they need to get to their control cards. They need to get to their win condition, and it's cards like this that make those decks even possible. So here it is, and there's some other cool draw cards in some previous sets too that are still out there, but this one I think is really amazing. Again, better if you can back it up with some artifacts, but you know what? A straightforward control deck can play this for 5 and be just fine because they're going to have a lot of mana behind it. And again, it gets better with Burrell. Savage Scutler, another card that is a nice little beater, but also turns on Revolt for you. So again, very fine limited card. You'll be happy to play it, especially if you have some good Revolt triggers in your deck. Shielded Aether Thief. This is interesting to me because I feel like in Aether Revolt, there's still a lot of great ways to get energy. But because it's a smaller set, maybe I feel like the energy payoffs aren't quite as abundant as we saw in Kaladesh. There's a couple cool cards. I mean, we'll be looking at them as we go throughout the week. But I think the really big payoffs, like your Aether Works Marvels and stuff like that, granted that's a mythic, but some of those big cards are in Kaladesh. And that's okay because you're still playing with some Kaladesh cards, right? In Draft, you're opening a pack, and in Sealed, you're opening 2 packs. So you might still hit some of those big things. But if you don't, this is actually a pretty nice place to siphon a lot of that energy into. I really like this card a lot. It's a 2 casting cost, 0/4 with flash. It gums up the board. That's kind of nice. A lot of times that's what blue wants to do. It makes your opponent think twice about attacking in with just kind of random attacks because it is going to let you get more energy, and that energy can be converted into card draw as the game goes on. That's actually kind of awesome. Even if you play this for 2 and you only draw 1 or 2 cards out of it, you've already got your value, and it feels really good to me. I think this is a fantastic limited card, and I think that this potentially could see some standard play. Again, it's going to have to be in a deck that's also messing around with energy, so it might not be your traditional control deck necessarily, but I still think this will show up. Maybe it'll be a more like an Izzet deck, or maybe that Jeskai combo deck we're talking about. It could fit in there. Shipwreck Moray. I like cards like this a lot in limited. I always like these +2/-2 flowstone style effects. I think they make combat very difficult for your opponent, and they have to think about a lot of possibilities that could happen. This one for 4 gives you a nice little blocker with 0/5, and it gives you 4 energy, which is pretty significant. And then you can pay 1 energy to give it +2/-2 till end of turn. So out of nowhere, this card could become a 2/3 or 4/1, and your opponent really has to think about all the possibilities in combat. Skyship Plunder, another very intriguing card to me. First off, let's talk about the stats for limited in general. A 2/1 flyer for 2, I feel pretty good about that because it's a nice little aggressive blue card. I can maybe get across with a couple hits. It's a nice little blocker in the air for some of the small flyers in the sets. So I like the stats right off the bat. Now, the ability is intriguing to me because if you can do combat damage to a player, for each kind of counter on target permanent or player, you give that permanent or player another counter of that kind. So it's almost like a watered down proliferate, which is interesting. Now, if you're not familiar with proliferate, basically what that says is when that triggers, that you can choose any number of target players or permanents and do exactly what this card does at this point and duplicate a counter on there. Now, this can only target one thing, but I do find it intriguing that the amount of targets it could have is very vast. It can hit Planeswalkers for loyalty counters. That's a big deal because a lot of times Wizards purposely avoids the loyalty counters on cards like this, right? It can, of course, do +1/+1 counters. That's probably the most obvious. It can do -1/-1 counters in some formats. As far as players go, you can increase infect counters. You could increase experience counters in Commander. You can hit energy counters. So it can hit a wide variety of things. The only thing that's a little bit awkward about that, though, is the fact that it costs 2 as a 2/1 flyer. Early on, you'll probably be able to get across with this, but early on, you might not have any targets for the ability. Later on, you might have great targets, but you might have trouble getting across. So that makes it feel a little wonky, but at the same time, I think it's still a fine limited card. It's a nice little beater, and if you can get some extra advantage out of it from time to time, it's pretty cool. Now, a lot of people have compared this card to Thrumming Bird, which was a very powerful card in the past. I don't think it's quite there because Proliferate, I think, is a lot stronger than the effect you're seeing here, but it's still a decent limited card for sure. Take into Custody. This is a card in Limited that's probably usually in your sideboard. There are times you may want to board it in. If you're playing a super intense control deck or maybe control burn style deck with less creatures, then yeah, okay, maybe you main deck this one. But I think for the most part, it starts out in the sideboard. It does let you tempo some threats anyway, and that can be good, especially again because blue doesn't always have a lot of good answers. Trophy Mage. Alright, this is actually pretty decent. Like, it's a 2/2 for 3, but I don't really care about the size of the creature at this point. I like the fact that you're able to tutor for an artifact with converted mana cost 3. Now, 3 is a little restricted. Like, it'd be nice if it was 3 or less, or even 2 or less. It's not quite Trinket Mage, I guess, for versatility purposes, but there's still a lot of good targets for it out there. And I do think because of that, you'll see this played in Standard. As far as Limited goes, if you have good targets at the 3 spot for artifacts, play it. If you don't, then you'll probably want to skip it. Next, we have War of Invention. A lot of folks have compared this to Court of Calling, kind of saying this is the artifact version of that card. But there's a big difference between this and Court of Calling, and that is the difference between Convoke and Improvise. Convoke, you can tap your creatures for either generic mana or mana of any color that creature is. In Improvise, you can't do that. You can tap your artifact, but only for generic mana. So even if I tap a Torrential Gearhulk, which is also blue, I can only get generic mana. Now, the Convoke ability on Court of Calling makes that 3 green a lot less punishing than the 3 blue is on this card. So this is going to be much harder to cast in a lot of ways than Court of Calling is. Having said that, the power level's still there though. So I have no doubt some folks are going to try to make this work for them in Standard, and it potentially could get there in a heavy blue deck. Just the ability to search your library for an artifact card with a converted mana cost X or less and put it directly in the battlefield, that's a big deal. I mean, you're able to tutor for, if you have the mana to back it up, just about anything, and that can actually be really, really strong. So I do think this will still see Standard play, even though it's a little harder to cast. It's not quite Court of Calling, but I think it's still a good card. And as far as Limited goes, I mean, a lot of times that casting cost is going to keep it out of your deck, but if you can swing it and you have some good targets for it, every once in a while it might come through as a good card for you. Windkin Raiders. This one is another just fine limited card. Not a whole lot to say about it. 4/3 flyer for 6, but it has Improvise, which makes it a little more forgiving. I like it. It's got the evasion piece. You can get some serious damage across the times when you need to, or it's a good blocker. All right, let's move on to the Dimir cards. And the first one is Tezzeret's Touch. Well, this one's very interesting. Hey, everybody, remember in Soul Artifact? Yeah, that seemed to be a good card. Well, imagine a variation of that for Standard again today. In Soul Artifact, very powerful in its day. I did really well in the Pro Tour. And of course, even still to this day, those aggro decks do very well in Frontier. This is a variation on that card. Yes, it costs 1 more. Yes, it's black, so you do have to invest in the 2 colors. The upside, I guess, that it gives you for that extra work is the fact that it does kind of protect the creature it's on a little bit. That's kind of nice. And Soul Artifact's probably a little more powerful just because of how explosive that could be on turn 2 when you throw that on an Ornithopter or Darksteel Citadel or something like that. But this card is at least really, really close, and that's probably still good enough, right? And oh, by the way, Ornithopter, yeah, that got reprinted too in this set. So I think because of the fact that people are so familiar with that deck and have really enjoyed that deck over the last couple of years, I think you're going to find that that's going to be a go-to archetype early on in Standard. I think a lot of people are going to try to recreate the magic of that install artifact deck, and potentially there could be some powerful versions of that get there. I think this card is good enough, and especially with Tezzeret Planeswalker to back it up, might have something there. And perhaps it is a Dimir control deck that's using that as its win condition, or maybe it's just more of a Dimir aggressive style deck. So we'll have to kind of see how that plays out in the meta. But yes, this will see Standard play. This will be great for you in Limited too. All right, speaking of Tezzeret, here's Tezzeret the Schemer. And here's the thing with Tezzeret. Some people are kind of split on him. Some seem to like him. Some are kind of so-so on him. I like him. Here's the biggest thing that I like about him. 5 loyalty for 4. So if nothing else happens, he's a great tempo play. Like, your opponent's gonna have to deal with it, and he comes onto the battlefield, you plus him right away. Now he's 6 loyalty. Getting a Planeswalker with 6 loyalty out of the way can be a pain sometimes, right? If you don't have a card that can take out a Planeswalker immediately. So just that alone is going to give you some tempo. But the card does a lot of good things. I mean, first off, it creates tokens that are basically like Lotus Petals. So it's going to help you with mana ramp, helps you get mana of different color, populates your board with artifacts when that matters. And oh, by the way, they can sacrifice for mana, so they turn on Revolt. So they do a lot of things. Like, there's tons of versatility there in the +1. The -2 does allow Tezzeret to protect himself. However, it's a little conditional. You do have to have a board state to complement that a little bit. So that's a little bit of a weakness, I think. But on the flip side, it's a +X, -X ability, so sometimes that could even be an aggressive ability if it needed to be, so I think that's kind of interesting. The -7, the ultimate, is not super powerful, but it's still good. The only thing that's a little wonky about it is you do have to have board state to back it up. You have to have targets for this thing in the form of artifacts, which maybe were those Lotus Petal-like artifacts, or maybe there's something else. But the reason it's not super destructive, I think, is because it's not that hard to get to. He's got 5 loyalty. You plus him to 6 the turn you play him. Next turn you plus him to 7. The following turn you can ultimate him. If he can ultimate that quickly and the ultimate was too powerful, that would be not good either, right? So I think the ultimate's fair, and it's not going to save you if you're losing and you don't have any board state. But if that's the case, you're probably not going to ultimate him anyway, right? So in some ways it feels like maybe a win more, but that's okay because I like the high loyalty and I like the other 2 abilities quite a bit. So having said all that, yes, he will see playing Standard. I think it's going to be a good card there. And this is another card that, if you're lucky enough to open in Limited, is going to be bonkers. And it also translates really well into Commander and even some cubes that want to play around with this theme a little bit. All right, next is our lone Izzet card of the day. It's Maverick Thopterist. And this is very good, especially in Limited. Like, I could see first picking this just because you could pay 5 or you could pay less with Improvise. But even if you paid 5, getting 4/4 power toughness on the board, 2 of which being in the form of artifact 1/1 flyers, feels really good to me. It kind of satisfies the whole idea of sometimes artifacts matters. You get a couple points in the air. Just a lot happening with this card for what you're paying for it, I think. And because of that, I think this can see some Standard play. As far as Thopter decks go, I mean, we saw the blue card, the enchantment that created Thopters a little bit earlier. Unfortunately, that's not quite a Thopter spy network. Like, I feel like this set could have really used, like, maybe that as a reprint or something that was a little more powerful than what we got. That could have really tied together a nice Thopter deck. As it stands now, I don't know if that deck exists in Standard, but I do feel like that this card will exist in Standard in some way, shape, or form just because of the value that it represents. All right, our last card of the day is Dark Intimations, and notice this is in Bolas colors, which is very fun, and the card itself is a throw forward to Amonkhet, an Hour of Devastation, and of course Nicol Bolas himself, and I think that's awesome. We used to see this sometimes in the old days of Magic with the Weatherlight Saga. In current Magic, you've seen throw forwards like this, but usually they're in the same block. Like, we saw that a card like in set 2 that will throw forward to a card in set 3 or something like that, but you don't necessarily see something throwing forward into a new block at least in recent days. So I think that's awesome from a story point of view as well as a mechanic point of view. I think it gets you excited about the next block and about some of the cards that'll be coming, and that's a great idea. I hope they continue this type of thing. As far as the card itself, I think it's a good card. I think power level is there that it will eventually get some standard play, maybe not right away because of the 3-color commitment, but I think when the next block starts up, those colors will probably be relevant to other Bolas related stuff, and it will probably be very playable in standard at that point. So get your copies now. At some point, it might be even better than it is today. As far as the second ability goes, obviously we'll probably get a Bolas Planeswalker in either Amonkhet or Hour of Devastation, right? I think that's pretty much a given. But it does interact with the previous one if you're playing this in Commander or something like that. But the card itself is a nice little advantage card. It takes away some advantage from your opponents. It hits all opponents, which again, good in multiplayer, and also gives you a little bit of card advantage, which is nice. So I like it a lot. I think it's going to be more relevant in the future, though. All right, having said that, those are all the cards for today. Actually, very interesting set of cards we looked at overall today. And this set just keeps coming with the hits, and we'll be back tomorrow with all the black cards, and we'll look at some of the multicolor as well. And we'll keep moving throughout the week as we finish up the color pie and then go into the colorless cards. So until then, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and have a great day. Hey, thanks as always for watching. This video is made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.